Welcome to Witch Hunt, the podcast discussing witch trials and related events. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack.
Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, America was gripped by a moral panic that had striking similarities to historical witch hunts.
Parents feared their children were being abused in secret satanic rituals. Police departments trained officers to look for signs of devil worship. And popular media warned that Satan's influence was everywhere, from heavy metal music to children's cartoons.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Scott Culpepper, a historian who's extensively researched this fascinating period of American history known as the Satanic Panic.
Dr. Culpepper, a professor at Dordt University, has just released the novel, The Demonologists' Daughters, adding to his contributions on the subject. In addition, his upcoming scholarly book about the panic helps us understand how this widespread fear developed, who promoted it, and how it changed American society.
We'll explore how ordinary elements of American life, from daycare centers to Dungeons and Dragons, became suspected tools of evil. We'll meet the colorful cast of characters who drove the panic, including fake ex-Satanists and tabloid TV hosts.
And we'll discover how this period of mass hysteria intersected with other social fears of the era, from working mothers to the AIDS crisis.
Dr. Culpepper also draws fascinating parallels between the Satanic Panic and the historical witch hunts, showing how moral panics follow similar patterns across time.
Join us for an eye-opening conversation about one of America's strangest periods and learn why its echoes still resonate in today's conspiracy theories.
Let's begin.
Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Culpepper. We are so happy to have you back for a third time.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy it. It's always a delight. So thank you for having me.
You bet. I've been waiting to get to this topic to talk with you on it. I'm really thrilled that you've gotten to this point with your project and we get to have this conversation today. Can you give us a little bit of background again on your work, just to remind our listeners who you are?
Yeah, I teach at Dordt University. I got my PhD at Baylor, and my area of focus is the Atlantic world from 1400 to contemporary period. And I've got a focus on the history of Christianity as well. So all of that feeds into this project in different ways. I wrote a book a few years ago on an English separatist pastor named Francis Johnson, who was active during the late 16th, early 17th century, which was the time when a lot of the witch trials were developing, and there was a lot of that sort of energy in the air. So that was adjacent to what I did for that project. And that really interested me. So I was drawn increasingly towards looking at the history of moral panics and the ways that that's influenced both the history of Christianity and the history of larger societies, not just in the West, but around the world, as you've demonstrated so well on the podcast episodes, that these elements that influence so much of Western culture, they're an active presence in other parts of the world as well. So I've been increasingly fascinated with those topics from 1400 to about the present time. My own personal history growing up in evangelical circles exposed me to a lot of the lore about demonology, possession, exorcism, spiritual warfare, and all that, which is a very integral part of many Christians' worldview. And so I grew up with those influences around me in the 80s and early 90s. And so I was increasingly drawn to ask myself, what were the larger cultural and societal forces that created the matrix, which I was raised in and which still has probably at least a little bit of influence on me, but which I grew away from in college. I continued to be a Christian, but different sort of Christian perspective than what I was raised with in some ways. Some of the things that we took for granted as non-negotiable aspects of our worldview, we've since learned aren't quite as non-negotiable or as solidly based on fact as we thought they were when we were younger. And so more recently, I've been doing research on the phenomena that was known as the Satanic Panic, or at least it was labeled that in the early 90s, where you had this very large societal buy-in to the idea that there were satanic cultic forces at work in American culture, very broadly influencing things negatively. And what was so amazing about this is it wasn't just the focus of conservative Christians who were following spiritual warfare theology. It became a more widespread cultural fascination to the point that government, law enforcement, popular culture was buying into this to such a degree that it literally wrecked reputations, ruined lives, resulted in one of the longest and most expensive trials in American judicial history. an incredible moment in American cultural history that continues to resonate. So more recently, that's what I've been doing, is doing research into that and crafting a nonfiction book, which is going through the pitching process right now. And hopefully we'll have more solid information about the timeline for when it will come out soon. Then I also write fiction. And so I've been writing some fictional works adjacent to that too, which hopefully conveys the feeling, the emotion, the issues at the heart of the satanic panic in a way that resonates a little more emotionally with people.
We got a sneak peek at some of that fiction, and I can say, yes, it does. I was pulled right in. My own upbringing is very similar to what you've expressed. And so this story is really, I'm going to jump right in when it's available.
That's great. Thank you. That's encouraging. You always hope that it resonates with people and especially your own experiences until you get started talking to people, you don't realize how shared they are across the spectrum. You think, well, it was just me or it was just our little corner of the world. And the more I talk to people like you, the more I realize this is such a common experience for so many people in American culture. The fictional component should be out in October. That's my plan. We're working to get it ready for release in October. It's called The Demonologists' Daughters. And my elevator pitch is basically what would happen if The Conjuring met Little Women. You've got the Conjuring series, which is so popular right now, and Ed and Lorraine Warren are such a big part of the story of the Satanic Panic because they, in so many ways, were capitalizing on the fears the Satanic Panic was stoking. They had this sort of ad hoc exorcism ministry where they went around attributing haunting to the influence of demonic powers. They gained a following, especially among people who are influenced by pop culture products like The Exorcist, to look for exorcisms as a way to help with different struggles that they were having. And they just made this cottage industry out of producing popular works chronicling their quote cases and different media like television, miniseries, things like that. And then eventually the Conjuring movies that were spinoffs of the stories they told about their cases. So it's a cultural phenomenon a lot of people are familiar with now. And they had a daughter, Judy, who appears as a character in the films. And she's been a pretty loyal proponent of their work. She's been a pretty loyal heir of their legacy. She and her husband have made it their mission to preserve the Warrens' legacy. The Conjuring films are one way they do that, and the continued existence of their museum of antiquities or haunted objects is another. They haven't had that actively open recently, but it still exists. And they do a pretty good job of trying to continue to promote the parents' legacy. I started thinking as I was working through all of this, what would happen if that family had more than one daughter, if they were located in a different part of the country instead of New England in South Louisiana, which I was more familiar with. And what if, yes, one of those daughters was like Judy Warren, who is very committed to the cause, but what if the other daughters had their questions, had their doubts, and they grew away from all of that? And then as adults are forced to come back and confront that world they grew up in and the tragedy they experienced when they were younger. So that's what the story is about. And it draws on a lot of the things I've been learning about the Satanic Panic to sort of try to invoke what that world was like, what those fears were like that haunted people's imaginations during that period.
Given all those fears, and the name panic definitely implies this atmosphere of very intense, widespread fear. The Satanic Panic is often cited as a strong example of a recent moral panic. How does it compare to other moral panics?
In a lot of ways, I think there are definitely similarities, though, of course, we always have to be very careful about historical context. Things have echoes, but they're never exactly the same. In the case of the Satanic Panic, I think one thing that distinguishes it from what came before and later is the extent of buy-in on the part of the larger American mainstream culture, at least for a little while, for a few decades. And there's a scholar named Sarah Hughes who's made the very good observation in a book she wrote that this was the same time when tabloid television was really taking off. And you think about Geraldo Rivera, 2020, a lot of the mainstream platforms that gave an opening for these people to gain widespread exposure, a lot of that helped this grow. So it was not by any stretch an isolated phenomena within some pocket of the church. It was something that powerful cultural gatekeepers are latching onto. In that way, I think it is somewhat similar to the witch trials in that you have a lot of folk hysteria. You've got beliefs in folk magic. You may even have concerns about people at the local level about things that are happening. But you have this kind of symbiotic dance that has to happen between the fears and superstitions on the ground and some of the more powerful leaders of society to make it a real threat. Like you might have some ongoing persecution or prosecution in local villages, but it takes buy-in by the judicial authorities or by rulers, like in the case of James the First in Scotland, to really make it a more widespread phenomena. In the same way, there's always a low simmering concern about demonic powers and spiritual warfare in Christian circles. That always exists because it's part of the biblical literature. It's a part of the beliefs of a good number of Christians. But you get something different when you get buy in for whatever reason by more powerful cultural gatekeepers. Another way that I think it's similar is that the fears that stoke the satanic panic are often stand-ins for other fears, like the stated reasons for why we're doing this, what our concerns are often code for other things that we're worried about, other cultural changes. One example of that might be the heavy push against daycares that occurred in the 1980s and 90s. And the most infamous case in the Satanic Panic concerning that, the McMartin preschool case, you had people accusing Virginia McMartin and those who worked at her daycare of having an underground chamber where they conducted satanic rituals that included flying around, abusing children, engaging in all kinds of weird black masses and satanic rites. So weird is described by those who were spinning the tales. It was just so fantastic in so many ways. It even involved imagined spaces. There was no underground chamber beneath the McMartin preschool at all. People literally were digging up the yards around it, trying to find something. Decades later, with the Comet Ping Pong pizza parlor incident, where you had somebody go and shoot up a pizza parlor because they thought there were pedophile rings and satanic rituals happening there, you had the same thing. There was an imagined space they thought existed there. And so you get this cultural fear that a lot of scholars would say is driven by the fact that you're in an era when, for the first time, middle class and even upper class women are reentering the workforce. It's the late 60s, it's the 70s. The number of kids in daycare is going up. And you've got all these anxieties about what kind of environment am I leaving my kids in all day long. And that probably has more to do with a lot of these suspicions and fears than any kind of concrete evidence. Obviously, there were places where real abuse was happening, and you don't want to diminish that. You don't want to overlook that. But sometimes things like this led to misdirection where they were focusing on alleged abuse cases that were, quote, satanic ritual abuse in particular places that weren't happening. And there were other places where it very much was happening, where that they were overlooking. The most glaring example being the fact that you had all these evangelical pastors and leaders engaged in trying to find the satanic cult activity in daycares while you're having an epidemic of sexual abuse in both the Catholic Church and many evangelical churches as well that gets overlooked. And that's another way I see a comparison. There's so often the witch hunts are misdirection away from other problems or other culprits.
You mentioned the Warrens and you mentioned the daycare. What other central characters drove the Satanic Panic?
So many, and such an interesting cast of characters as well. Two at the inception are on opposite sides of the conversation. One is Anton LaVey, who most of the audience has probably heard of before. LaVey created the Church of Satan in the mid 1960s as a very obvious troll of Christianity. There was never any pretense that they actually believed in a real devil. It was a very Nietzschean sort of will to power philosophy that they embraced. And they had all kinds of rituals that looked like black mass rituals, but they were very clear that what they were doing was essentially trying to troll Christianity, being sort of a satirical mirror to the Christian church and American culture. LaVey fabricated most of his background, as we learned in 1991 when Texas Monthly published a story about him. An investigative report revealed that much of his backstory had been fabricated. He had talked about being a circus ringmaster. That may or may not be true. Dating Marilyn Monroe. That was definitely not true. and a number of other things as well that were found to be fabrications. But he created this very popular movement, at least popular around San Francisco for a little bit, that got many Christians around the country up in arms because whatever their intentions, the imagery looked very satanic to them. That was the idea, that they were sort of clothing themselves with satanic imagery to make a point. And then you had the Manson murders occur in 1969, and there were allegations that there were connections between Manson and Anton LaVey. Investigation demonstrated that those connections were loose at best. I mean, they traveled in some of the same orbits, but there seemed to be no formal connection between them. But in a lot of ways, Manson's followers tried to make their activities look like they were satanically inspired or under the organizing principle of some kind of general belief system, to the degree that they were worried about appearances at all. And so you had that occur in 1969, and that to some degree raised the stakes a bit for the Church of Satan. They found themselves by the late 80s very much on the defensive, because they had a lot of people accusing them of things they had never imagined doing, satanic ritual abuse and all of that, to the degree that LaVey's daughter, Zena, would make the rounds in the late 80s on different news programs trying to rehabilitate the reputation of the Church of Satan. Well, on the heels of Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, there are popular Christian speakers to some degree who are reacting to all of that, beginning to publish accounts of their own supposed escape from organized Satanism. And one of the most popular of those was a Christian singer and comedian named Mike Warnke, who released a book in 1972 called The Satan Seller. Warnke claimed that for about a year and a half or so, he had been a satanic high priest, leading a coven of about 1,500 people or so. The numbers would vary depending on the audience he was talking to, in the San Francisco and Los Angeles areas. He claimed to have met Anton LaVey and had lurid stories about the things that he had done as a satanic high priest, which that alone should have raised people's skepticism when he released the book in 1972. As you read through it, you're thinking, if any of this stuff is true, why is this guy not worried about the authorities coming and knocking on his door and arresting him for some of these things that he participated in? But he writes this story, very lurid imagery, and you can definitely tell reading the book and then comparing it to pop culture products of the time, that in so many ways it draws more on imagery from movies like Rosemary's Baby than it does from anything that had been circulating in Christian theology, at least in formal Christian theology. Joseph Laycock has written a book with a co-author called The Exorcist Effect that came out recently. In that book, he talks about how films really conditioned the expectations people had for satanic cult activity during this period, what exorcisms look like. Once you get The Exorcist released in 1973, essentially people's view of what an exorcism should be is conditioned by the film. You see a definite change in people's expectations of both what exorcisms look like and the frequency of them as well. So you get people like Mike Warnke, who becomes a celebrated figure in evangelical Christian circles. And there's also a prophecy writer, Hal Lindsey, who is known for his sort of end times writings on Revelation and the book of Daniel. He also writes a book in 72 called Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. And he kind of adds to this interest in satanic lore and the notion that there are satanic cults operating in the country. The book that really puts it all on the radar of big time media moguls and tabloid news is Michelle Remembers, which came out in 1980. And that's probably the one that more people in the audience have heard of. Michelle Smith, this is an alias, started seeing a psychologist named Lawrence Pasdar. And during their sessions, supposedly she recovered repressed memories of ritual abuse that she had suffered as a child. And the longer they worked together, the more memories came out and the more graphic they got. And Pasdar and Michelle Smith published together this memoir, Michelle Remembers. She divorced her husband. Eventually, they got married as well, which, of course, raises all kinds of questions about the professionalism of their interactions. But they started going on speaking tours. They and Mike Warnke were very welcomed amongst law enforcement and would actually host clinics to advise law enforcement about how to find satanic ritual abuse and how to identify where satanic cults were operating. And from there, you get a whole list of people who begin to write and issue popular books that claim to have familiarity with satanic ritual abuse, claim that they have been insiders who are now telling the true story to everyone. One of the most interesting was a woman who appeared in the late 1980s named Laura Stratford, who wrote a work called Exposing Satan's Underground. She claimed that she had actually been a baby breeder held by a satanic cult, forced to give birth to children that were then sacrificed in horrific ceremonies. And that she eventually broke away from that, converted to Christianity, and began to spread the word of warning about these groups in America. She was supported and platformed by people like Hal Lindsey and Hal Lindsey's then sister-in-law, Johanna Mickelson, who had very popular media ministries in Southern California. And because of that, she got a tremendous boost early on. When Geraldo Rivera made his second special on Satanism in America, the subtitle was Exposing Satan's Underground. And he had excerpts of interviews with Lawrence Stratford, with Mike Warnke, with Johanna Mickelson, and a number of these people whose names are coming to be known not just in evangelical Christian circles or the Roman Catholic Church, but in the larger American mainstream culture as well. In about 2 years, there was an evangelical magazine that was run by a group called Jesus People USA that was headquartered in Chicago that published exposés on some of these figures, including Lauren Stratford and also Mike Warnke. In the Stratford expose, which was the first one they did, they had gone and interviewed family members. They had gone and looked at official documents related to her personal history. They found no evidence that she was a part of any kind of satanic cult, that her parents engaged in the activities they said she engaged in, and in fact, no evidence whatsoever that she had ever been pregnant at all. So basically, her entire story unraveled. Mike Warnke came to her defense. And so the reporters at Cornerstone, listening to some of what he said, well, maybe we should take a look at this guy as well. And so in 1991, they investigated him and soon released a story that revealed that his entire background was fabricated in regard to his involvement in satanic activity of any kind. They found evidence that during the time he claimed to be a satanic high priest with long hair and a drug addiction, that he was a buttoned up, short haired guy who was working with campus ministries at his college in Southern California. They discovered that instead of dating his first wife, he was actually married 4 times eventually. Instead of dating his first wife at that time, like he said he was, he had been dating another woman, and they found her and interviewed her. And she said, no, none of that stuff is true. And at one point she said, would you think I would know if my boyfriend was leading a satanic cult? And to which everyone replies, we would hope so. So it just completely unraveled. His ministry absolutely implodes in the early 90s as it's revealed that this entire backstory that they had gained so much influence circulating was just pure mythology. So those are a few of the characters, and there's so many more as well. I could just list them endlessly.
Yeah, 2 years ago, I was cleaning out a relative's garage, and I came across the Hal Lindsey book you referenced,
Mm.
Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. Uh, I've since lost track of what I did with the copy, though.
You're not losing much financially. I don't think it would sell for much if you tried to sell it, but it's a great curiosity.
Mhm. Yeah, it raised my eyebrows right away. What's this and why is it here?
One thing that's interesting about all this is you don't want to be puritanical, so I don't want to commit the opposite error of being overly judgmental. But at a time when these people were making family values preservation a big part of their platform for why we need to be aware of satanic cult activity, both Hal Lindsey and Mike Warnke are married 4 times. And those marriages, at least a couple of them in both cases, fell apart because of adultery. All at the same time, these people are presenting themselves as paragons of family values.
And you talked about how the culture kind of led to or contributed to the rise of the Satanic Panic. How in turn did the Satanic Panic contribute to the culture?
In so many ways, especially probably most visibly in music. Musicians figured out very quickly that satanic imagery really would help stoke their brand. They're all accused of it. About even like Elvis, someone who we would today consider as benign as Elvis, is accused of being influenced by the devil's music. And a lot of people are suspicious because a lot of that music that he was spreading was music that he had inherited from blues traditions and other traditions that were more associated in the popular imagination with African American cultures. That's where they came from. And so he's beginning to bring this music into the mainstream, and white kids are starting to listen to it. And there's a little racism there, as well as fear about social depravity that's coloring the way some people see Elvis. Then, of course, you have the Beatles, you have the Rolling Stones, and increasingly they're accused of fostering reprobate activity. They're accused of being an instrument of Satan. And over time, musicians start to sense it pays to wear this mantle of rebellion. And so they'll do it increasingly. Led Zeppelin, there was an interest there in Aleister Crowley among a couple of members of Led Zeppelin. When you get to the mid 70s and early 80s, there's a free flowing wave of sort of satanic imagery, pentagrams, and allusions to Satan in popular music. And some of them would say, we're just having fun with this. We were shocked at the kickback. Iron Maiden says that when they released the album, The Number of the Beast. They have that song, The Number of the Beast, on the album. And their response was shocked when they came to the US. And there was such a huge pushback from a lot of evangelical and Catholic ministries. They were like, we're just having fun with these concepts. We didn't think we were taking them seriously. So some of them may have been caught by surprise. Others, like Motley Crue, they knew exactly what they were doing. They released Shout at the Devil, and they knew that imagery really drew focus. It drew attention from teenagers who are wanting to embrace the rebelliousness of it, and also was something that made them cultural outliers. The idea of cultural outlying, it was really in the very center of mainstream culture in so many ways. So yeah, you saw that impacting the popular culture. A lot of the movies and television that comes out is very much driven, interestingly enough, by the panic. One of my favorite stories in that regard is this little TV movie that came out based on a novel in the early 80s called Of Mazes and Monsters. The novel was written by a novelist, Rolla Joffe, who was known to publish a variety of different works. She was never known as a particularly conservative writer, but she became concerned about Dungeons and Dragons and the possible influence it was having on young people. And all of that was driven to some degree by this story of a young man who had disappeared at a college in Michigan, and then he had been found in Louisiana. They had returned him to the college, and then he committed suicide. And there were allegations that this guy, James Eggers, had been very into Dungeons and Dragons, and that had been a part of pushing him toward suicide, basically. And it didn't help that the detective on the case, William Deere, a private detective the family had hired to find this kid, he titled his account of it, quote, "The Dungeon Master." And what's wild about it is Deere knew that it wasn't D&D that had driven him to commit suicide, that there were other factors. He had a troubled relationship with his family. He was gay, and his family was putting pressure on him and denying that aspect of his identity. And ultimately, those were the other factors. He was a kid who was gifted, had started college early, and felt very out of place. So it was hard for him to find his place because he was so much younger than the other students. So that story ended tragically, but a lot of people took the legends and myths about D&D's role in all that. By the early 80s, they were concerned about it. You had this novel Of Mazes and Monsters that was published, which basically was a fictional account of a group of young people who are playing Dungeons and Dragons. And the game becomes so real to them, they lose the distinction between reality and fantasy. And things escalate to the point that one of the young people tries to commit suicide and is stopped by his friends. The person they get to play that kid in the movie version is a very young Tom Hanks, fresh off Bosom Buddies and just then becoming very popular. And so he makes this film, and it's a curiosity today. It wasn't a big budget thing. It wasn't something that just shattered records or anything like that. It was a TV movie, but it was part of the zeitgeist at that time, and it's still a bit of a cultural curiosity. Not long after that, you had a mom who lost a son to suicide, Patricia Pulling, who was also convinced that D&D was part of the cause for why her child committed suicide. And she starts this organization, BAD, which basically invests in trying to limit D&D and other influences they think are inspiring their kids to be influenced by satanic forces. One funny thing about the Tom Hanks story is he made Mazes and Monsters of Mazes and Monsters early in the 80s. And then he comes back towards the end of the 80s and makes The Burbs, which I don't know if you've seen that, but The Burbs is like a riff, a comedic riff on satanic panic fears and all of that. It satirizes all of it, except don't want to give away the ending, but it does in the end pull its punches a little bit, like the people you think are goofy and are just on a rabbit chase. They are on a wild goose chase. They do have some merit to their investigation, but overall, it's intended to sort of poke fun at the suburban fears of cult activity at that time. So it would be great at some point to talk to Tom Hanks if somebody could get him to discuss all of that and talk about these two bookends that he does at the beginning of the 80s and the end of the 80s, one of which kind of helps feed the satanic panic, and the other one which kind of satirizes it and asks the question, have we gone too far with all this?
There's so much fantasy with fear. The fantasy can cause evil. We don't really know what the evil is. It's this monster. Is it coming out from under the bed? Is it waiting for us? It's so fascinating in not a great way. But how do we end moral panics?
Now, that is the challenge because they rage so ferociously. And if someone tries to address it, they're almost immediately labeled as being part of the problem, which again is something that's a parallel with witch trials. One thing that's very noticeable about some of those people I discussed earlier, people like Mike Warnke and Lawrence Stratford, is that you had to have some people from within the evangelical community, those journalists for Cornerstone, actually challenge their credentials and expose to people what was going on. They were still pushed back on. In fact, there were people connected to them that were accused of being satanic cult members, even though those people were involved in anti-cult ministries in Southern California. So it's not foolproof. You still get that pushback. But kind of like we said a while ago about John Winthrop Jr., it helps to have a person who has some measure of trust that tries to capitalize on that trust by revealing, hey, this is not an us against them thing. This is not the broader culture trying to diminish or destroy something you hold dear. It's people trying to hold you accountable to be factual and careful in the ideas you embrace and the people you platform. That did help to some degree. I think kind of cultural exhaustion helped to some degree as well. By the early 90s, people were getting a little bit tired of it, and also the fact that law enforcement had embraced the possibility that this stuff existed for real for a while. And the longer they investigated, by the time you get to the early 90s, in case after case, you're coming up with nothing, absolutely no evidence. You had leading FBI officials that started to release reports where they said, we've done our very best to investigate this alleged activity. It's just not there. And so over time, eventually, it starts to break down just the truth, the sheer factual reality does begin to degrade some of those conspiracy theories, but they don't completely go away. And even in the late 90s, after the court cases have been shut down and you no longer have a lot of serious legal persecution of people on the basis of satanic cult activity or satanic ritual abuse, you still have pushbacks against Harry Potter and you still have that floating around in the zeitgeist. But thankfully, by then, it had lost some of the teeth of being embraced by officials with the power to actually unleash legal and political pressures against people. Probably the last major prosecution of someone that could be associated with the Satanic Panic was the Memphis Three in the mid 90s. There were three young men who were accused of murdering some little boys. Uh, Basically just on the foundation that they were known to be into heavy metal music and to have satanic imagery on some of their binders, their notebooks, and all of that. That led to them being incarcerated for a while before finally they were allowed to be released and cleared, and still a mystery to this day who was involved in killing those kids. That was probably the last major gasp of it in the mid 90s as far as it being an official thing, something where government authorities and others could be involved in actually prosecuting people for these things. Of course, the other side of that is it continues to echo in some elements of popular culture. And there's a big debate regarding whether we're going through another satanic panic now. Some people would say, in some ways, maybe, because you've got a lot of accusations about people connecting themselves to cultic activity. You've got conspiracy theories like those propagated by QAnon, where they'll allege, say, for instance, members of the Democratic Party are part of some pedophile ring. And all of that resonates very much with the same kind of accusations that were being spread during the Satanic Panic. One thing we don't have at this point, which might lead us, and there's several like the scholar Bethan Juliet Oakey, who has said, lead us to say that we're not going through necessarily a full-blown satanic panic at this point, is the fact that the legal process has not been co-opted to serve its interests. For the most part, mainstream media has not. Where you see these kind of things in media today, it's usually in horror fiction, or it's through things like The Conjuring, where it's more fantasy than it is anybody suggesting these things are really happening for the most part. So you do have that lack of buy-in by the major mainstream culture. That's reassuring. On the other hand, one thing that's not reassuring is the fact that you do have some of these ideas permeating the highest echelons of political influence. Very noticeably, the kind of people, the kind of evangelicals that are surrounding Republican leaders at this point are different from the ones in the 80s. You could definitely have your criticism of the ones in the 80s, people like Jerry Falwell Sr., who pursued a political agenda that was driven by their religious goals as well. They were coming from like fundamentalist Baptist circles and other sort of old school fundamentalist circles, which made them a little bit wary of overly demonstrative Pentecostal charismatic style behavior. They would not be the kind of people that would sign on very quickly to theologies about exorcisms and deliverance ministries and all that, or notions about angels being at work influencing the political process. That changes, I would say, about 1988 or 89 with the campaign of Pat Robertson for president. Robertson, of course, did not get the nomination. George H.W. Bush did. But he did well enough that he was able to build an organization off the back of that. And one of the lessons he learned during the course of the campaign, so a lot of people are not going to be fooled by a televangelist running for president. They were very quick to point out that he was a televangelist. He was not a politician. He tried very hard to shed that mantle, but they could play clips from the 700 Club that showed him like stretching his hand out to heal people through the TV and getting a word of prophecy and all that. So it was not something he could really live down. In 88, after his campaign, he built this infrastructure at his Regent University in Virginia Beach, Virginia, that included bringing in Jay Sekulow to lead the law school there, bringing in Ralph Reed to form this political action group called the Christian Coalition. And over the next few years, they created this sort of Pentecostal, charismatic, evangelical political action movement that didn't have some of the same baggage. A lot of the people they were training and platforming were people that hadn't been on TV doing this kind of stuff. They could keep that part quiet and give a more respectable public face on the surface. That movement really grew. And in many ways, it has taken over much of the evangelical influence. Example of that would be during the presidency of Donald Trump. The advisors he had around him very often came from this wing of Protestant Christianity, not as much from the wing that previously influenced presidents like Ronald Reagan. Again, not that that was great, but what we're seeing here is something a little bit different. You have people like Paula White, who explicitly leads prayers where she invokes the power of God and the power of angels to defeat forces of spiritual darkness she sees as, quote, coming against the goals of the president, the goals of the country. At one point, she very famously called on angels from Africa and Asia to come and to be a part of the political process in the 2020 election. So on the one hand, you don't have some of the same cultural buy-in. Some of those cultural gatekeepers are holding the line against these things and hopefully wouldn't go back and endorse it to the extent they did in the 80s. On the other, as recently as the Trump administration, you did have some people who were very convinced this stuff was real and very willing to use the levers of power to act against it, who have a great deal of influence. So there's still the possibility that you could see that kind of influence extended in various ways officially.
I see a couple echoes today that show this continuing legacy, perhaps, of the Satanic Panic in current political thought. One that you mentioned regarding Paula White, the spiritual warfare. I'm seeing a lot of literal demonization of political adversaries, where you're literally saying that they are servants of the devil, that they're things to that nature. And then another wave that is happening is are these allegations of grooming, particularly by the LGBTQ community. And that reminds me of the uh, preschool allegations.
Yeah, very much so. And I do think probably homosexuality was in the background a lot of these conversations as well in the 70s and early 80s. As we talked about the young man at the center of the D&D case, or the case in the late 70s, he was homosexual, but very closeted because of the circumstances he was living in. And a lot of the conversation around like D&D or heavy metal culture, a lot of times it would have this sort of bent where there were references made to the kinds of kids who don't play sports. Because a lot of times those are the kids who are playing D&D, or to kids with long hair or whatever, which you get that throwback to the 60s and early 70s as well. But some of these biases, and it's not always said out loud, but a lot of the racial things that you see, both with the witch trials and in the Satanic Panic as well, there's often an undercurrent there that you get the sense, especially if you look back with an eye to more recent concerns and issues, things we're aware of now we weren't as aware of back then. There is an undertow of anti-LGBTQ. There's a racist undertow. I mean, when you look at the people who are driving this, a lot of them are white, conservative, middle class Christians of different varieties. The culture that's gripped by these fears is often white, middle class, suburban culture. So you see a lot of those elements. I think that's very true. I think you're right that that is very much in the undertow of these conversations. That quiet part's not always said out loud. Sometimes it is, but it's definitely there in a lot of ways. And sometimes it is said out loud and in very hateful ways as well. This is also the period when we are going through the AIDS crisis, at least the beginning of the AIDS crisis. The Reagan administration was notoriously slow to respond to that. C. Everett Koop tried to push them to faster than they did. And part of that was because in the beginning, they saw this as a disease that people dealt with who were up to things they shouldn't be up to. Therefore, we shouldn't be as concerned about that. And certainly, all of this intermixed, all of these tendencies intermixed as people are confronting those fears and trying to decide how do we respond to them. There was a sense in white, suburban, middle class America that's somebody else's problem until you start getting kids like Ryan White who get it from a blood transfusion and they realize it's not their problem, it's our problem.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that also because those were two of the great panics that I remember from my childhood and youth were the Satanic Panic and the AIDS Panic. There's so much misinformation floating around about both things. I would hear rumors of goats being sacrificed behind the school and things like that. And then this misinformation about how AIDS was transmitted and who was likely to get it. And I was just curious, how did these two worlds ever intersect, the Satanic Panic and the AIDS Panic?
Yeah, I would say so. Constantly, of course, in references by Christian musicians, preachers, and others, they had a big bundle of things that Satan and his operatives were up to in America, and certainly homosexuality was on that list. And there was a widespread sense, whether it was said out loud or not, that AIDS was in a way a judgment on the homosexual community. And then, of course, later they have to revise that because it's affecting other people as well. But early on, that was the cause of a part of the lukewarmness towards actually addressing it was this notion being propagated that this is a punishment people are suffering because of wrongdoing. It's funny how the folklore feeds the panic and the panic feeds the folklore. And sometimes people just having fun, just wanting to be out there and do something rebellious, feed it as well. We had all those stories as well about things happening in the woods. It was great to be scared by that. I've always loved ghost stories and I love the macabre. I love to watch horror movies. And so there was an element of that that was fun in the sense that you like to be spooked a little bit. And it wasn't great when you're out in the woods at night to remember all those stories, but when you're home with your friends in a comfortable place, it's fun to tell those stories. And there were instances where people would go out and they would like create what might look like a satanic ritual circle or whatever, fed by mythologies that were being circulated. Like they would do this to mimic the kinds of things that people were saying. Once it was investigated, it would be revealed this is just a bunch of kids having fun. You did have a couple of real instances of killers that were at least using satanic imagery in their writings and in their presentation. Whether they actually believed it, who knows? But you did have, for instance, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. He really leaned into the idea that Satan was speaking to him and that he was acting as an agent of the devil. You had Sean Sellers, a young man in Oklahoma who killed his parents. He claimed that he had been influenced by Satan to do that. And you have the whole question with cases like that, the chicken and the egg question. To what degree do these people really believe this stuff? To what degree are they acting in response to those folklores that are circling, casting that as their motivation when it was really other things that motivated them? It's so hard to tell. But those are a couple of instances. They're rare instances, but they were enough to get some people saying, see, this is what we're talking about. People like Richard Ramirez, people like Sean Sellers. You had kids that would commit suicide when they were listening to heavy metal music, kids that would commit suicide who had played D&D. And several people made the point. Sarah Marshall, who's got a podcast called You're Wrong About, a little bit ago, she made the point on her podcast, how many millions of kids had D&D paraphernalia that may have bought it and never even played it that much, but when they're discovered after they committed suicide, have got that paraphernalia in their home. As prevalent as this phenomenon was in the early 80s, it was very likely that you're going to probably find a subset of people who committed suicide who had some involvement with D&D, but then statistically, they could go back and demonstrate that that was a very small subset of the total number of kids who were ending their lives in the 80s. There were a multitude of other reasons why that was happening, why that was such a horrific problem during that period.
And what was the likelihood if you took your own life that you had other kinds of books or
Mhm.
other things in your possession? You could point to any kind of thing and make a trend out of it, that they had science books or they had religious books or anything.
Absolutely. Again, echoes of the witch hunts. It's so easily to associate, so easy to associate an object, a common household item like a broom or owning a black cat and make that sinister somehow. How many people own black cats that were not women and were not witches in the early modern period?
Right.
Yeah. And then you have that element of alleged witches questioning, am I the witch? Maybe it is me. Or the guilt of their other hard experiences in life where they may have made the wrong choice. They think they're deserving of being accused of witchcraft and harm. And even in modern allegations of witchcraft, you find the individuals wanting to prove their innocence by doing poison tests. It is that chicken or the egg thing. And there, I just can, it's unlimited how many examples there are of crime confessors who attribute the problem to the devil. And even, magistrates and governments attributed their confusion about witch trials to the devil.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And when you think about cultures like religious cultures, where there's a huge guilt that people carry for various activities or even having thoughts about particular things, if they come in and tell you these thoughts are being driven by satanic influence or possession, there might be an appeal to that in some ways because it's hard to believe that's you. Hard to believe that whatever temptation or whatever obsession you've got or whatever darkness is a part of just your humanity, maybe some of that is just satanic influence, and maybe there's an easy way to purge that through an exorcism or through some kind of ritual that can free me. One thing I would see in Louisiana, especially among Pentecostal charismatic cultures, was a lot of people engaging in what was called deliverance ministry, having sort of an ad hoc exorcism performed on them as a way to help them deal with alcohol problems or the ramifications of sexual abuse or various temptations. I knew one person who had gone through a very rough divorce, and they were struggling with a lot of emotional trauma from that. It had been both physically and emotionally abusive. And she sought help from a deliverance minister. And there probably was a bit of an effect there, not in the sense that she was actually experiencing demons being cast out of her, but she believed that it was doing good for her. And so she would go with regularity to have these ceremonies performed that she felt like freed her from the things that haunted her. So you can really see how there's an attraction because they feel like it's an aid at a time when they feel like there's no way out of some of the situations they're dealing with. I guess the positive side of that is it could sometimes be a placebo that would help people to heal. But on the other hand, one of the difficulties was if you had someone who, for instance, was dealing with substance abuse, I would see them go to these counselors, get these exorcisms, and their belief would be, okay, I am delivered from this. Now I will be fine. And obviously, we know well, knowing people struggles with addiction, it takes daily work. It's hard. There are relapses at times. It's a daily struggle. And a lot of them would get very discouraged when that struggle would reappear and they would realize, no, it's not gone away. And it would lead even to them questioning their faith on the basis of that. So we'll see it have that opposite effect as well.
We're near the end of our hour. Is there anything that you haven't had an opportunity to talk about today that you'd like to express?
I guess just the pop culture phenomena of it is one thing I haven't mentioned as much, but was just both the fun and bizarre part of that. The number of pop culture things that we would see as being very innocent today that got caught in the crosshairs of the Satanic Panic. D&D is one of those. I teach at a Christian school, and almost all of my students in the history department play D&D, probably a little more than they should sometimes. I had one guy that had an assignment due, and he said, "I'm behind on that, but I was crafting my new D&D character." And I suggested he might want to get around to working on the paper first. But today, that's no big deal. Nobody cares. Even in Christian circles, they do these things and it doesn't bother anyone. It's become a very benign thing, at least in most Christian circles. There are still some that would probably frown on that, but it's become a very benign thing. The Smurfs were regarded as a pervasive demonic influence because you had Azrael the cat, who is said to be named after an ancient demon. You had magic being used all the time by Gargamel and Papa Smurf. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, the power of Grayskull and all the magic there. So it's great going through and reading some of the critiques of things that today we just take as a matter of course, as benign influences in culture. It's a curiosity and it helps to look back to that and look to the present and see some of the things that are said about pop culture products today and be able to make the case. You say this is so harmful. Well, look at what they said about these other things, and they were not. But civilization did not fall apart because of them.
Thank you, Scott. Now, Mary Bingham returns with an all new Minute with Mary.
One of the many factors which culminated in the Salem witch trials, now seriously being dissected by historians, is mass psychogenic illness. Simply defined, this circumstance results when anxiety is morphed into physical ailments and usually occurs in a group setting, where the power of suggestion is strong. The outbreak of witchcraft accusations started in the household of an influential family. In 1692, the minister was an esteemed member of the community. The Salem village parsonage was small. It was Elizabeth Parris's job to keep the atmosphere calm. However, her husband, Reverend Samuel, behaved otherwise. He bellowed his sermons from the second floor with the children in earshot as he threatened to, and I quote, demonize his enemies, who were about to cut off his firewood supply. This would have made for a cold winter with no means of cooking food. Thus, the anxiety experienced by Betty Jr. and Abigail may have turned into physical manifestations. According to the local doctor, the children's symptoms didn't match any of the ailments known at that time. The power of suggestion could have added to the phenomena when news started to travel. But what do the listeners think? And I got my source this week from A Storm of Witchcraft by Dr. Emerson Baker and pages 99 and 100. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary.
And now Sarah has this week's edition of End Witch Hunts News.
Welcome to End Witch Hunts News. Hysteria and moral panics are not relics of a bygone era, but ever-present threats. While we may look back on events like the Salem witch trials or the Satanic Panic of the 1980s with disbelief, it's crucial to recognize that these phenomena do occur in our modern world, in the form of witch hunts and satanic panics. We talk about it here with experts, and you can easily identify them through your daily news outlets. These panics often emerge from the constant and complex interplay of fear, misinformation, and societal stress on our lives. Ever-present realities in society, these panics are often fueled by authority figures who exploit their trusted positions to stoke fears about unsubstantiated threats to children's safety, using their own word or selective reporting as the sole substantiation. When we hear about a threat that's causing widespread concern, it's important to take a step back. Together, we can look at the facts and ask ourselves, is this particular worry based on solid evidence? It's not about dismissing concerns. When presented with news of a community threat, consider reflecting on these key questions to help maintain a balanced perspective. What is the source of this information? And is there verifiable evidence supporting the claim? Who benefits from spreading this fear? And are there alternative explanations we haven't considered? Is the suggested level of alarm proportional to the actual risk compared to other known threats? It's natural to feel conflicted when you find yourself disagreeing with a source you've traditionally trusted. This is an opportunity for growth and critical thinking. Remember, even reputable sources can sometimes be mistaken or biased. Trust your judgment, seek out additional perspectives, and be open to reevaluating beliefs based on new information. It's okay to change your mind when presented with compelling evidence. Consider the following fictional story as an illustration. In a quiet suburban community, Dr. E, who's completely fictional, a respected child psychologist and school board member, began raising alarms about a supposed new threat to local children. With her credentials and standing in the community, parents and officials listened intently as she spoke of a dangerous online game allegedly spreading among students. Dr. E claimed this game was causing children to engage in risky behaviors and even self-harm. She cited vague statistics and anonymous case studies, creating a sense of urgency and fear among parents. Local media picked up the story, amplifying her warnings without thoroughly fact-checking her claims. As panic spread, Dr. E advocated for strict new policies, monitoring students' online activities, banning certain websites, and implementing mandatory counseling sessions. She positioned herself as the expert on this crisis, gaining more influence and attention. However, further investigation revealed a more complex truth. The online game did exist, but its dangers were greatly exaggerated. Dr. E, it turned out, had recently co-founded a private counseling center specializing in internet addiction. By amplifying the threat, she was driving concerned parents to seek her services, significantly boosting her new business's client base. Moreover, the panic she created diverted attention and resources from other, more pressing issues facing local youth, such as underfunded mental health programs in schools and rising rates of substance abuse. These problems, which require long-term, systemic solutions, were overshadowed by the more sensational but less significant threat of the online game. Instigators, like Dr. E, can target any group or idea, turning neighbors against each other and undermining the fabric of communities. The mechanics of these panics, the rapid spread of unsubstantiated claims, the demonization of the other, and the suspension of critical thinking remain remarkably consistent across time and cultures. In our digital age, the potential for panic to spread has only increased. Social media and instant communication can amplify unfounded fears and conspiracies, giving them a global reach within hours. It's essential to remain vigilant and critical, questioning sensational claims and seeking verified information. Education about historical panics isn't just an academic exercise. It's a vital tool for recognizing and resisting similar patterns in our own time. By understanding the warning signs and psychological factors that drive these phenomena, we can work to create a more rational, compassionate society resistant to the lure of hysteria. From well-intentioned but misinformed concerns about emerging technologies to misplaced blame for complex social issues, modern panics can have real-world consequences, leading to misallocation of resources, erosion of community trust, and implementation of misguided policies. It's up to all of us to stay informed, think critically, and promote a culture of reason and empathy.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Witch Hunt.
Join us every week.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.